Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. I am your host, James Azar. Follow me on Twitter, James_Azar1 to get all the latest on security and privacy. I've got a great episode for us today. I've got Dr. Saif Abed. Yeah, literally, he's a Dr. Saif. And we're gonna and in more ways than one. And he's joining us via video from London. And we're gonna have an amazing show talking about how a medical doctor who went through medical school, got into cybersecurity. Like, you go through 12 years of school to end up fighting cybercrime. So we're going to get started on this episode here in just a moment. But before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Get Smart Eye. That's Get Smart Eye, like your eye, EYE.com. It's a new security company that's focused on your privacy. How many of you guys have eyes around watching your screens, your phones, your tablets? No matter where you are, it can be your own office, an airport, a train station, a co-working space, and even a coffee shop, right? But there's some documents and some information that really needs to stay away from prying eyes. That's where Get Smart Eye comes in. They're using the latest biometric technology to give you complete control over the documents you send and who sees them. Whether you're viewing them yourself or sending them for someone else to view them, the Get Smart Eye technology ensures that whoever's seeing it is the right person. And should someone who shouldn't see it grab a look at it, it gets the document to disappear and won't reopen it until it verifies the identity of the person you sent it to. So to get more information, go to getsmarteye.com/James. Again, that's getsmarteye.com/James. Again, getsmarteye.com/James. Dr. Saif, thanks for joining me. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. I've been really looking forward to this. I think there's going to be some interesting stuff we get into.
I know we will, because I know we will, because you're like, whenever you and I have spoken, the conversation just flows and it just goes into places that, I think our listeners are going to really enjoy. So make sure, pray for traffic on your commute if you're listening to this while you're commuting, and pray that your boss doesn't bug you if you're listening to us at work. So here's the deal. You're in beautiful gray, sunny, rainy, sometimes nice, definitely the best walking city in the world, which is London. Did I get all that right?
I think you've covered all your bases there.
I have. I know I have, because like whenever I go to London, I walk 15 miles a day easily. You don't even feel it. Like, I look at my steps on my phone or watch, and it's like, you've been walking for 17 hours.
Oh, you're right. I definitely can't complain. It's a beautiful city. I'm lucky to be here, and I highly recommend your listeners visit.
So if you haven't been in London, make sure you go. And then, how do they get in touch with you? Do you have a Twitter handle so that we can let all of our listeners know early on?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is @Saif_Abed, exactly how it's spelled when people listen to the podcast. And I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm very active on both.
Awesome. So here's the thing. Most people, when they go to medical school, Dr. Saif, they kind of want to stick to medicine. How in the world did you end up in cybersecurity?
I think that's a fair question to ask. I get asked it a lot. I think, like a lot of people end up in security, they fall into it kind of by accident. So to give you a bit of context, right? So when I was at medical school, there was something being driven by central government called the National Program for IT. It was this 11 billion pound national digital transformation program for the health sector. Now, unfortunately, that has not been considered a success. Took 10 years, I think one of the most expensive IT projects driven by a government globally. And, people can look into it if they want, but it wasn't considered a success. Now, sitting there as a doctor who loved tech, wanted to see what it could do at medical school, I was always thinking, okay, what was the missing part of the puzzle here? And I kind of thought a big part of it was no one was talking to the doctors and the nurses on the front line. I thought maybe, this might sound a bit nuts. What if I set up a company that tried to do that bit of the puzzle? So finished med school, qualified, practiced medicine, set up a company to do that, Abed Graham. And then our first big client was the largest identity and access management company in healthcare. It just fell that way. It wasn't something that was planned. And I didn't even think of it as a security thing at the time, but we started working with them. It was great. And then I started writing more about security, public speaking. And then I wrote an article in 2016 because I saw ransomware was creeping up in US healthcare. So I wrote an article saying, these are all the different ways ransomware could cause clinical harm to patients by targeting IT systems in hospitals in England. Some people liked the article, didn't get too much traction. Fast forward a year later, well, WannaCry happened. And suddenly journalists were typing in ransomware, National Health Service, and my name was popping up. We got a lot more attention. And then really we became more of a cybersecurity focused company at that point. Now we work with government agencies in healthcare over here. I advise the European Commission. We work with big tech companies looking at, really major infrastructure, national security type stuff. It's really cool. I love it. As I say, I fell into it by accident, but every day it's a fascinating place to be working in. Yeah, if you told me when I was at med school that, say, if you're going to end up fighting cybercrime, as you put it, I would have asked, if you've had one too many to drink. But here we are.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. When I saw your biography, I was like, how in the world this? I mean, I don't know what it's like in England, right? But in the US, to be a medical doctor, it's 8 to 12 years of hell just to be able to practice medicine.
Hey, I'm telling you, it's tough. I've been there, and I think that's what a big part of the difference of the work we do today. Everyone in my team is a doctor or a nurse who's then specialized in risk and security. Because look, at the end of the day, you can talk about firewalls, you can talk about mobile device management, whatever it is, a supplier wants to talk about. If you have no idea what the doctors and the nurses are doing on the front line, both mistakes and workarounds, but also what they care about, then you're just selling tin. If you're a government agency coming up with policy looks great on paper, but the rubber needs to meet the road at some point.
Right.
And that's what's really important to me when I look at security. How does it actually create a benefit?
When you think of the medical industry as a whole, how did it become such a target for hackers? I mean, you brought up the greatest, one of the best points, which was WannaCry literally paralyzed NHS in England. I mean, it put a stop to a lot of hospitals from even being able to do the most basics of services.
So there's a couple of points there that I want to unwrap. First of all, yeah, WannaCry was a watershed moment. I think no one would dispute that. I think the thing we need to appreciate is that it wasn't a targeted attack. It was completely opportunistic. The Eternal Blue exploit wrapped in WannaCry. It was put out there. It affected many organizations around the world. Just unfortunately, the National Health Service wasn't one of them. You'll see statistics cited about the technical side of how it was damaging, but I want to put things into context for you. So in the UK and in England, we call health systems trusts.
Right.
So 5 trusts had to divert ambulances away from them. They had to effectively shut their emergency departments. Now, that sounds terrible by itself, but if you're a patient who's suspected of having a stroke and you're in an ambulance, you have a 3-hour window of opportunity to get that clot in your brain busted. Every minute counts. If you're then being diverted away, that's another 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. That's the difference between you rehabbing and coming back to something close to normal function and you ending up not being able to use your left arm and left leg. That's the reality of what a cyber attack can do. You feel it, the patients can feel it. So that's the first thing. It was an opportunistic attack that had a terrible effect, but it could have been a lot worse. I would suggest we were lucky because it was that burning platform for major investment and a shift in government policy to focus on cyber in healthcare. So it takes me to my next point. You say, how did we end up with healthcare just globally being this really attractive target for healthcare? So I call this the arbitrage opportunity. Effectively, when I look at a sector, I look at its level of digital maturity versus its level of security maturity. I think this is something all your listeners will all be comfortable and familiar with. But ultimately, the health system slowly started to digitize over the last 20 years, replacing paper with digital workflows. So the digital dependencies started going up and up and up and up without necessarily good enough backup plans. The security maturity stayed way down here. So there's this arbitrage gap, whereas an attacker, you go, there's something I can exploit here. There's urgency I can create. All these digital dependencies, but no real security around them, people, processes, tech. So then you think, okay, what do I get out of this? And then it depends on the motivation of the attacker. Financially, you could be like more of on the amateur end of the spectrum, buy and sell patient data in the US healthcare market. Yeah, there's value in that. But in European public sector markets, not the same value. That's when you get into creating urgency because of threat to life.
Right.
That's when you get to ransomware. That's when you get to the life-threatening stuff at scale. And that's another end of the spectrum. I'm fascinated by cyber warfare in healthcare. And I say, so what if it's not money? What if the attackers are just looking at disruption because of geopolitical reasons? Well, you have national health systems. That's a completely different ball game again. So there's many layers to that onion, as we can both see.
No, you bring up what I think is a really very interesting point, which is the motive and intent behind a cyber attack is never just money. And I think one of the things I'm starting to notice, just at least in my research, is there's no such thing as useless data. Hackers don't value one data over another. They value data in general because they mine it. They have a way of mining it. They have a way of digging through it to find, the smallest or tits beats of nuggets that help them create value for what they're doing. 9 times out of 10, you say WannaCry was a kind of an opportunity crime, and it was in a way. I mean, I don't think the people who wrote WannaCry anticipated the kind of success with that kind of ransomware that they had. I feel like in monitoring some of the dark web discussions, one of the trends I noticed was this was like really, really successful. I mean, for them, this was kind of like, wow, like this is awesome.
Well, so here's the deal, right? And I think that this is corroborated by my writing, right? I'm here from 2012 to 2016, writing about the risks of, the cyber attack or information security risks in healthcare. And, people are paying attention because it sounds interesting, but no one's really felt it, or they're not feeling it at a big enough scale. And
Right.
I think part of the equation is the bad actors also didn't realize that healthcare was this really attractive target yet. And WannaCry, it created two opportunities, right? If you treat the cybercrime sector as a business in its own right, as much as we now invest in healthcare, the attackers are going, hey, healthcare is such a great opportunity. We could cause havoc. We could create urgency. We can get financial returns. We could sell our services for all kinds of purposes to cause disruption in health systems. So both sides are in a race. And what I always say is, well, the attackers are always ahead of the defenders, right? That's my viewpoint. We have to be lucky all the time as the defenders. They need to get lucky once, and it's about how good is our incident response after that.
We have to be good every single day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They only need to be good once to be successful.
Exactly, and that's for me. Coming back to the doctor side of my brain, that's terrifying when you look at, we have inpatient e-prescribing modules. We have IoT coming in intensive care units. You just think the bad actor gets lucky once. They might not intend for anyone to get hurt, though personally, I don't think they care. But someone could die, if not just have a terrible outcome. That's a bit better than dying is the best way to put it.
As you bring up a really good point, and when you think of WannaCry, and you think of the aftermath of it, have you seen hospitals start to look and change the way they perceive security? Has it, you say before WannaCry, before 2017, before that awful morning where, systems started getting locked out and people had to pay. The morning after, are you noticing a shift? And was that shift, a lot of times you see a spike and then things go back to the way they were because people forget about it. It just goes down to set of priorities. Has that been, the same trend you're seeing, or is there really a lot more attention on security in the healthcare field now?
So I can say, I think at central government levels, there's been a tremendously positive move forward, right? There's been lots more investment, lots more briefing papers coming out, a lot more interest from the government perspective in, at least I would say in the UK, in the security of the public sector as a whole and the health system. But there's only so much central government can do. You can lead a horse to water, as they say, you can't make it drink. And I think at the local hospital level, here's the challenge, right? And I think this is mirrored in the work that I've done and seen in the United States. A hospital only has so much budget. It's trying to invest in all these digital transformation projects, buy a new electronic health record system, or invest in analytics, mobility, whatever it is. You have all these objectives. You have to balance the books to deliver patient care and core services as well. And then you've got this thing called security that, well, you might be a hospital that has a really good IT department, but has no true security people. You probably don't have a CISO. The board level has heard that IT is important and they should do digital transformation, so they're supporting it, but they don't know what security is. So everyone's speaking at cross purposes, speaking different languages. They don't have necessarily the level of expertise that they need to guide them appropriately. So yeah, I think security is definitely on everyone's lips now. Do they feel comfortable knowing what the right decision is? I don't think they're comfortable yet. It's still, they're not mature enough on the subject to do that. Combine that with every supplier under the sun trying to bombard them to sell them the latest security technology and tell them you need X, you need Y, you need Z. And they're kind of sitting there going, look, there's all this technology out there. But then, as you put it, the intellectuals and the academics and the government agencies are saying you need to focus on the people and processes, not just the technology. And if you're sitting on a board with no background in IT, let alone security, how do you approach that process? It's kind of analysis paralysis. So yeah, it's on everyone's lips. Some are more advanced than others, but I completely sympathize with why it's so difficult for them to really tackle this issue.
Do you feel like that's more of a medical industry, healthcare issue in terms of people who are supplying devices to hospitals? That security should become a standard within the manufacturers rather than being expected that the hospital itself should carry that burden on
Yeah, I
top of
mean,
all the other burdens they have?
so we actually have something really interesting and forward thinking in England. We actually have a standard that's mandated by government called the Clinical Risk in Healthcare IT Standard. And what's interesting about that is that it expects both the supplier of any software or hardware system, connected system, and the hospital to have a clinical safety officer to vet every deployment of every software and hardware, as essentially of every project, and to keep a live log of all the risks and incidents that can be associated with that and its mitigations. Very difficult to pull off. Most places struggle to do it. But I think that's the kind of platform where you go, okay, look, there's a responsibility on the supplier, but there's also a responsibility on the healthcare provider. But neither of them can do it completely by themselves if they're going to tackle the risks appropriately. It has to be, takes two to tango, ultimately.
Right.
What I will say is a big part of my focus, the majority of my focus is on the big software projects that are implemented. And that's obviously encroached now into the world of IoT. I do think one of the problems in the IoT space is that the big medical device manufacturers are influenced by ultimately their share price. There's a moral hazard associated with this. I kind of think that, now I'm going at a slight tangent, so just humor me for a second.
You're
I
fine.
think I think it was Chevrolet who had a bit of a scandal back in the 90s where their engines would catch fire when there'd be an accident, and they calculated the cost of, should we pay the fines whenever this happens and pay the litigation costs, or should we recall all the vehicles and pay for them to move the engines? Now, it might be another brand, so I might be wrong, but this is quite a famous case. It's you hear it in business school a lot. They thought, you know what, we'll just pay the litigation. It's cheaper. We'll take the hit there rather than pay for the recall costs. And I think that what worries me in the medical device space is that going to be the same logic and moral hazard? It's like, well, until the attacks reach a point that they're so threatening that people boycott our products or a government steps in, as long as the share price is doing okay, well, we'll just deal with it, on a play-by-play basis. And that's what really concerns me in that space.
You bring up a very valid point, which is no patient goes to a hospital and goes, "Are you using, this company's medical devices?" "Oh no, I don't want to be treated by that." When you're ill, when you're not feeling well, you don't care what they're using as long as you get better after, they treat you.
Y- Yeah, yeah, completely. And you have to imagine as well, it might be slightly different in the US because of how physicians work, but certainly in most health systems around the world, you you follow whatever the regulatory agency advises. So if they say, look, this is the pacemaker this is the list of pacemakers we've authorized for use in this country's health system, as a physician, you just use one of those devices. You don't think about the security of the device. You go, well, this is clinically proven as a good device for my patient. I will fit it in my patient because they'll get a good outcome. So there's so much, it's very easy for us in the security world to silo our own thinking and say, why does everyone think about security all the time? Well, it just doesn't rank in many people's thought processes when their primary function is patient care or some kind of sort of customer experience or what have you. It falls down the metrics table when it really shouldn't. You made a really critical point. You said about secure by design. Yeah, we definitely need to have that. But I think on the healthcare provider side, they need to shift, if they can, over time to a zero trust model as well. It is very difficult to trust your supply chain today. I think the supply chain is such a monstrosity of vulnerabilities
Right.
when you really think about it. It can be paralytic when you think about it. But you need these suppliers to deliver patient care. They are so important. They deliver great services for the most part. But if they're not addressing security enough, then you have to have zero trust. And you can't assume that
Well,
they are addressing it.
so I want to get into that debate with you real quick because
Okay.
I think that's a challenge. The supply chain challenge exists across every single industry. It's not just limited to healthcare.
Yeah.
The you started talking about digital transformation. I think that's a big buzzword now. A lot of CISOs and CIOs and CTOs hear this word. I call it a buzzword,
I agree.
because it's what it's what most, I want to say, vendors always kind of go to. They go, what about your digital transformation? Technology is developing at a faster pace than anyone can keep up with.
Yeah.
There's now use cases of blockchain in medical that are very, very successful in terms of record keeping and file sharing between different organizations and different doctors. So if you live in Manchester and you're in London and you're sick, through the blockchain you'll be able to see it. But on a global kind of vision of it, if you're German but you're in Poland on vacation and you get sick while you're in Poland, there's been a use cases that have shown that through the blockchain, the hospital in Poland can actually go and pull your medical records from Germany to be able to treat you. And this especially goes true to threats in places around the world where you have massive incidents of death or chaos, where you don't have time to get a patient's medical history. But when you look at the zero trust model, and you think of how difficult it is to secure the supply chain, part of digital transformation involves innovation and startups. And startups don't necessarily address security. They develop a product and they want to use that product right away because they're trying to get their investors money. How do you even begin to address that? I mean,
Oh,
how do you even develop a zero trust model within your supply chain when you need your supply chain so much?
oh, you make such a great point. Like, let's be clear. Most of the organizations I work with, my firm advises, are the large, really large infrastructure companies, and they, have so many questions about how security should work in healthcare. Now you get to the startup level, and these guys are trying to have a minimum viable product, and they're trying to be agile and all these things. And you know what? It's they're a completely different kettle of fish. It's so challenging for them. Even if security is even, when they have their little business canvas model, has security even entered that conversation when the business is being created, let alone being launched? It's definitely very challenging. What I've found to be very fortunate in my work is working with the European Commission. We've looked at things like cross-border information exchange, the kind of stuff that you mentioned. AI and blockchain comes up a lot. And what I say is, I'm always the guy. I don't know what the idiom is in the US, but I'm the party pooper, and I'm the guy in the room going, "Look, we shouldn't be innovating for the sake of innovating. We should have a genuine problem we want to solve. And if there's an existing solution that we can use for it, we should. But if there isn't, then we should get innovative. I think innovation in and of itself, and this is going to be controversial maybe for your listeners, I think innovation is a buzzword. It gets thrown about so much. Everyone considers themselves to be innovative and innovating, whereas in reality, most things are just incremental changes or sheer plagiarism.
Right. It's just a better version. It's version 2.0 of what version 1.1 was.
Exactly. So what I tend to say is, if you're going to have something along the lines of interoperability and information exchange, irrespective of sector, but it's going to be cross-border in nature, or even take you from a regional level to national, then in my view, you're automatically must assume you're connecting insecure networks to one another. You're creating the scope for a contagion effect. We just spoke about WannaCry. You're creating the platform for a WannaCry scenario. And to me, if you're in a safety critical sector that requires interdependencies on a wide geographic area, then, great to innovate because it'll make you more efficient and have more outcomes. But the other side of that coin is, wow, boy, if I was an attacker, would I find that really attractive?
That's it's so true. I was at RSA, and I know that InfoSec's coming up in a few weeks in London, and
Yeah.
that's a really big cyber conference, and it attracts a lot of people. And I always find these big conferences that have, the vendor show going on. And as I walk around and I hear people pitching their product to whoever they're talking to without properly vetting the person, without really qualifying, because that doesn't really happen. When you're at a show, you've got your elevator pitch down, and that's what you're pitching. And if you're a hacker who understands social engineering, you're coming in there, you're walking around, you're picking up on some of the key products, you're understanding who they target, you understand how the product works. You really don't even need anything to understand how to beat it. I feel like in the name of sales, we're really putting out products, and then we wonder why security doesn't really hold up in a real life environment sometimes. And well, here's our answer. You have all these different events, and no one's really vetting who they're talking to.
Well, James, just think about this. Think about how awkward it is when you have someone like me who walks around InfoSec. Let's say the people on the stands don't know who I am. I walk up to the stand and they say to me, "Oh, which organization are you from?" And I say, "Don't worry about that." And they say, "What do you do?" I say, "Oh, I'm a doctor." And they think, "Oh, are you like a cybersecurity academic?" I say, "No, I'm a medical doctor." So exactly like your reaction at the beginning, they don't say it, but they kind of give me this look of, "Why are you here?" I say, "Don't worry. I'm in healthcare. I'm interested in securing healthcare. Tell me how your product is relevant to me." And it's not, no one in marketing or in sales training has told them how to talk to someone who's on the front line, who's not a person directly in charge of procurement. It's a very uncomfortable conversation because they don't know whether to pitch technical jargon. They don't know how to pitch business benefit because they don't know what the front line looks like.
Right.
And I say to them, look, don't worry about it, but just, it'd be good to connect, but just bear in mind, you have just sold me nothing because you had no idea, and it's not necessarily your fault, about what the reality of my sector is. And I think that's a major problem in the industry. Verticalization hasn't taken hold, apart from to make it easier to divide up sales teams, whereas actually there's a lot of education required.
One of the aspects that you bring up here, and I think it's so important, is you work with a lot of big organizations, but the prime target, at least what we see in the US, is these smaller medical facilities, these smaller clinics in the more rural areas of any country. Those guys tend to operate with very small budgets, and when they do a innovation of sorts, they typically innovate to the cheapest, best product they can find,
Yeah.
which typically doesn't address security. And then they are the first to go down. And the danger there is, like you said, when WannaCry happened and you were in London, well, there's a hospital every 10 minutes. But when you're out in the country, the next hospital could be an hour or two away.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we even start to address that specific cyber challenge cybersecurity challenge in healthcare, because I feel like the big hospitals, I feel like will always find a way to survive. There's enough
Mhm.
also within the local municipalities where, high population areas, you're not going to let big hospitals go inoperable. But it's the smaller rural communities that could serve, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 people, that when that goes down and someone has a heart attack and you can't use anything, well, you've just pretty much made sure that that person is dead.
You've made a really excellent point, and I've seen this in England and in different parts of Europe. You start getting into Scandinavia, you see that coming up, and I'm starting to do some more work in the US, definitely seeing that pattern as well. And I think that's where it comes to the point where there's two levels here. One, the healthcare organization itself needs to do a very honest risk assessment of the risk and benefit it provides its local community. Uh, just because a hospital is small, it might think of itself as not a target, or it might think, if we're taken down, it might not be a huge issue. But if you are the only hospital that offers specific critical services within a certain catchment area, then to that community, you are a high risk asset. I can't comment on how government works in the United States, but certainly from a local government perspective in Europe, you are a very critical asset, irrespective of size. And so I think the first thing it comes down to is education at the board level. Yeah, I really think you can't get past that, because CIOs will struggle to get limited budgets diverted towards them, and specifically towards security, if they cannot get across to the board or to the executive team how critical their organization is as an asset to their local community. It might be more than a local community, it might be a regional community. So I think that's really important. I think a critical point you also made is about who they tend to spend money with. So when I say my firm advises the larger organizations, just to be clear, I mean the IT and infrastructure companies providing the technologies and services. But through them, I often end up working with the hospitals themselves, who are obviously the end recipients
Right.
of the technology. So I've seen the full span. Now you're right. The bigger the brand of technology, the more sophisticated, the more expensive, the more likely it is to end up at a huge teaching hospital or health system. You work with the more medium-sized vendors, they're more likely, I've found, to supply the small to medium entities. I've seen that correlation. It's not necessarily universal, but I do see it. And so you have to make sure that the suppliers themselves are risk assessing who their customers are. And sometimes it might sound counterintuitive, but they need to invest more in the smaller customers, the smaller healthcare organizations, to make sure their solutions are fit for purpose, because they are such high risk assets.
Right. I think one of the challenges we see in security in general, and not only in healthcare, is you can go and buy a solution and a product, but it still requires you sometimes to have someone to maintain it. And that's an additional person on payroll that takes away from your budget. When are we going to get to the point where cyber products really maintain themselves, where you're not going to have to hire a team of people to manage a solution, because that doesn't solve your problem? That only adds to it.
I think that's going to be a really interesting problem to resolve. And I think the intermediate solution to that, and this isn't necessarily giving a viewpoint on it, but I think the role of the specialist managed service provider, it could be really quite critical here. Right now, the managed service provider element of the market is still very generic. There are loads of security MSPs. I haven't seen that many highly specialized sector specific ones. And I think that could be something that evolves over the coming 5 to 10 years to fill that gap, at
Right.
least in the intermediate
You
period.
bring up a very good point though, when I'm always very critical of vendors. Um that's why on my show I never have an actual cybersecurity vendor on my show. Um
Mm-hmm.
I've tried it. It was horrible. I never aired the episodes because
Wow.
it
Okay.
just it just became a FUD pitch. And um and I felt like the whole idea of technology solves all your problems is setting false hope. Most seasoned security folks understand that your product is going to help shape my security. It's not going to really give me the ultimate protection, because that does not exist. I think once you're able to sell that to your board and you go, You brought up a very good point, which you say, how does a CIO in a smaller facility go? And it's all about board education. The challenge you have with a board is their whole point of view is we want to not only have profitability, but they care more about patient care than they do about anything else. Patient care matters. Most people that sit on a healthcare board are doctors. And doctors care about saving lives. They care about patient care. They don't care about security. And security becomes, what do we do when we have an attack similar to WannaCry? And what I've seen from some of the board meetings I've attended in hospitals here in the States following WannaCry has been, what's our business contingency plan? And most of the time the CIO isn't even part of that discussion. It goes to the hospital administrator, who goes, well, we're going old school. We've got these 5 doctors here that we're going to call up, and we're going to go back to old school medicine. We're going to become unreliant. And the question that should have been followed by the board that I've never heard is, how do you anticipate your old school doctors that have become so technology reliant to be anywhere near as effective using old school treatment mechanisms or old school devices to really provide proper patient care? If you use GPS on your phone to get through the city, you become so reliant on GPS that if you drove once without GPS, you would be lost. You would miss your turn.
So James, you make a fantastic point, and I want to throw something out there, something that may be actually helpful to your listeners if they're going through this challenge. So I'm sure everyone's recognized that in cybersecurity, we love to steal phrases from healthcare, viruses and payloads and cyber hygiene and immune systems. We like that in cybersecurity. I tend to call it out, but it's cool. It's cool for what it is. But one of the things that I do think is a nice merit. So obviously, in cyber we have prevent, detect, respond, and recover. Same thing in healthcare. But here's the thing: in healthcare, we focus, when we're managing the care of a patient, we focus disproportionately on respond and recover. Most people come to hospital are already ill. That's why they're in hospital. Whereas the whole movement in healthcare is towards prevention, population health, preventing people from getting ill in the first place. Now in cyber, it's actually the other way around. We're focusing all on prevention. You need a firewall and you need an X and a Y and a Z, but there's not enough talk about reacting and responding. Incident response does not come up on the radar anywhere near where it should. But incident response is that major conversation piece that needs to be happening at the board level, and the product strategy might stem from that. But what I'm saying here is that essentially one of the things in cyber and healthcare is it needs to be a two-way street again. Okay, if there is a major incident at a hospital that have had, ransomware incidents happen in a few states, in Indiana, Georgia, a few others. What I say is, okay, one thing is, what is the technical response? How are we going to survive technically and get up and running? But then there's another, what I call a mini immediate arbitrage opportunity of harm. Well, at that same time, how are we going to coordinate clinical care with the technology that we do have? Or if we don't have any technology to play with, how do we maintain a certain level of patient safety and clinical care? And that should be all wrapped into one cyber response strategy. It shouldn't be, here's the clinical team and what they're going to do, here's the IT team what they're going to do. They've never spoken to one another, and then they deal with the scenario as it turns up. That makes it a more board level, interesting conversation that can go somewhere.
I feel like the challenge with incidents response on the board level is all they care about is business continuity. And as long as you have some sort of business continuity plan in place, you're okay. And most companies have business continuity plans. And what I've seen when I've worked with organizations on incident response is they pull up their business continuity, they look at their fire drill, they go, well, what happens if your building is shut down? Oh, well, fire drill says we leave the building, we put up our backup call center somewhere, and we send people home to work from home until we, assess the situation, and then we communicate it. And I go, well, that's great, but people don't have access to your network. Where's that in your business continuity?
So that's the thing. So what we have done is actually we've come up with a business outcomes model to take all these cyber scenarios and turn them into clinical, organizational, financial, reputational cost benefits, so that when you're at a board level, it doesn't matter who the stakeholder is, you can speak to them in their language. One of the ones I like to say is, forget all the sexy cyber attacks, on pacemakers or electronic health record systems. Let's say you have your staff car park system is connected to the network, and you take that offline. Suddenly staff can't get in. Suddenly you get a queue of vehicles trying to get into the facility. Some of those are emergency vehicles. Some of them are just patients turning up for their outpatient appointment. You're gonna mess up both your revenue stream in your elective care, but you're also gonna have a major operational clinical harm and therefore litigation and regulatory issue because of your emergency cases that get tampered with. And you can suddenly take that framework that we have and you paint from a simple car park barrier, set of car park barriers not working, a whole bunch of different costs that the board may never have considered. They might say, oh, well, they'll just park off street. They don't need to use the car parks. It's like, yeah, but people don't act rationally immediately. They start queuing. And then when the queue begins, that's when the operational disruption suddenly spirals out of control. What do you do then? You're then looking out the window and your hospital, all around it has turned into a car park, not just where the cars are meant to be. So, it's not the perfect example, but there's a lot of scenarios that if you have the right lens, you can create the metrics that the right people on the board can start to appreciate.
So I know you work a lot with government and you advise the EU Commission and you work with a lot of different government and state and local officials in the UK and other places in Europe and some in the US. But is the answer to the board, because this is the common thing you hear constantly whenever you're at a conference, whenever you're on a panel that talks about, how do we get more attention to security? And to go, well, we need more government intervention. We need them to pass laws that'll hold people liable and accountable, and that's the only way to get the board's attention. Um, as someone who's always, I'm all in favor of as few laws as possible and letting
Mm-mm.
free market kind of letting the market do what the market is supposed to do, because there's always that piece of it. Also, I don't really trust elected officials, who some could have been bartenders for 6 years and all of a sudden become elected officials, to write legislation that would be anywhere near effective, outside of being maybe wasteful and creating unnecessary work. Does it really need to be kind of government's role in helping kind of facilitate this discussion, or should it be more of a industry, you know, like an ISAC or, you know?
So this is a complex question. I think I think anyone who just heard the question could appreciate that. First thing I'll state is, I'm very much a free market type of person. However, you heard me reference arbitrage a lot, and
Right.
arbitrage exists because the market doesn't correct itself immediately, and it's in that arbitrage opportunity that harm can happen. So to recognize when the market hasn't corrected itself yet in its behavior, some kind of authority needs to be in a position to act to ensure that in that correction phase, harm doesn't happen. And in safety critical industries, I don't think you can get around that. I think it's very difficult to just say, well, the market will operate as it does, because the market has moral hazard within it and has perverse incentives. So my view is that what we need, and this might not be popular at this moment in time, given the direction of global politics, but I do think there needs to be some more trust in having independent experts form committees that actually have legislative teeth. And for example, I do think there should be a national incident response subcommittee dedicated to healthcare that can issue regulated, mandated decrees, authorities, whatever you want to call them, or that has a resource that it can deploy, for example, to specific states or entities when they are going through an incident. I don't know how that would correlate in the US, but that's something I'm very supportive of in England is having an independent healthcare specific incident response committee made up of acknowledged experts in the field who can be mobilized into action as required. I think otherwise harm will happen. And I don't think it should necessarily be in the hands of elected officials. And I would suggest that my hesitancy isn't so much necessarily the quality of the official themselves, but we have election cycles. Let's say you have a well-intentioned, very talented official. Well, if you have a 4 to 5 year election cycle, by the time they're actually getting around to getting anything done, well, they're not in power anymore. Someone else comes in who's not as talented or has a completely different worldview, and you're just playing football with something that's really important. That's more my fear. So I do think we need some kind of regulatory authority. I think it should be independent from kind of party politics or opinion, and I think it needs to have teeth, so it can actually take action rather than just issue guidance that you can take or leave. And I think that should be the global approach, personally, if central governments are thinking about it.
You made a very, I think, really good point when you say that, in elected terms, you could lose very talented people where they get nothing done. I think the challenge is that when you look globally on political landscape, typically you've got 20% of the people who are elected who are very talented and are very pragmatic and understand the balance between business and government and the need for regulation, but also the cost of it towards a business.
Yep.
Because I think most people who always, and I hear this a lot, that say the government should be doing something about this. I feel like they're missing the point. And the point I feel they're missing is when government regulates, it costs business money. When it costs business money, that extra is passed on to you, the consumer, whether it be in your healthcare bill or it can be in your taxes or any other way. It's passed to you somewhere down the road. And I feel like when you look at I don't want to get into the political landscape because I feel like that's just too complex. You're absolutely right when you bring up the point that there should be some sort of subcommittee that handles this stuff. But I feel like with cybersecurity, especially on the healthcare side, it is so global. Healthcare is dominated by global players. There aren't any really local players. And if we're able to create, and if there's an ability to form a global responsible body that goes and works through industry to create industry norms, because that's the best way. I mean, when you look in England, as someone who was in fintech, right? Wow, how did I forget the regulatory, the financial regulatory, the FCA?
Yes.
In London, they create a sandbox. And when they create a sandbox, they did this for blockchain early on, right?
Yep.
They said self-regulate. Use the basis of KYC to self-regulate. We're going to observe. We're going to see how you're self-regulating. We're going to see what you're doing. And we're going to deem whether it's appropriate or not once we enter this into law, once we make it a formal regulation. Based on the self-regulatory practices that you do, we will deem what would be appropriate as part of that regulation.
Yeah.
And that's a very good way for a regulator to let businesses start create a regulatory framework that doesn't cost the business a lot of money, that also operationalizes it, that creates an industry consensus. And that's what happened with the FCA. And I think in healthcare, which is global because every healthcare manufacturer is pretty much global today. There's very few local players. This consortium of thought that you bring up should be addressed within the industry that then allows government to go, oh, that's a great standard. We should adopt that standard. And the manufacturers and the big hospitals have already adapted to it. It's already in their cost structure. So you're not really adding anything. You're just making it legal.
So I think that's a really, that's a good point. And this is, the next part of my journey in my career, beyond, just the obviously I'm biased, but the great work I think my firm does is, working with the European Commission is a great experience, and it's exposed me to a lot of areas and countries to contribute to their security development. But the next step is, we need to talk to the United Nations, we need to talk to NATO, we need to talk to the World Economic Forum. We need to have independent subcommittees focusing on healthcare and cybersecurity through those agencies. But those agencies need to have their same equivalents at the nation state level. And I think if you can get that framework with a unified language at the global agency level, tie it into local nation state equivalents, you then start forming a framework where actually we can share best practice, we can develop mandated standards between allies, and we can then influence industry in a two-way communication. The industry can influence us in return. As I said, I am a free market person, but I also recognize that the market doesn't correct itself fast enough.
Right.
But we need to have a two-way conversation. No one should feel like they're getting the raw end of the stick in this. But, and this is now the doctor in me saying this, these global agencies and the industry shouldn't use this as an opportunity just to have nice dinner parties together. They need to get stuff done.
Agreed.
So I think that's the framework. That's what I want to push for. Those are the types of agencies I'm trying to talk to, as well as intelligence agencies and whatnot, because it's really interesting. There's a slight aside again. Healthcare agencies in government have a lot of, they know healthcare, but their maturity in terms of security is only, it's still nascent. Intelligence agencies have a lot of experience of operating in sensitive areas and around security. But for them, healthcare just has only recently creeped in as a sector to deal with as a national security issue or otherwise. So there's this Venn diagram, and I really want to make sure that people like me and others who are interested in it, either through these global agencies or otherwise, can help bridge that gap. Because healthcare, as much as it sounds as though it's its own vertical, is the responsibility of so many multidisciplinary agencies, and we all need to be on the same page.
So we're almost out of time. So one final question. What is the future state of cybersecurity in the healthcare industry?
The future is a more attuned executive leadership into the challenge that security poses, but also the opportunity that it poses. I think security won't just be seen as a cost on the balance sheet, but will start to be seen as a critical business enabler. It's going to take time. It's going to be difficult. But the risks are so high that we're going to be forced to talk to each other, to work together, and protect patients so they can make the most out of all the innovative technology that comes to the fore and not get stung by the risks.
So, Dr. Saif, I will say two things. This has been a really fun conversation. I want to have you on again. I want to keep this conversation as kind of things evolve. I'm sure we will be facing a 0-day kind of attack on healthcare. We see it happening in Eastern Europe quite a lot now. And we pray that no lives are lost in this process, but in like all things, and you started off this podcast with probably one of the best examples. You've only got an X amount of time to treat someone to get them back to being a functioning member of society, and if you don't get it done by that time, you pretty much sign off on it. And so my at least hope in the message of our show and our podcast and bringing people like you on is that we get more people to pay attention and start thinking outside of the box to really come up with the right solutions and understanding something that I've said from day one. Cyber is a global problem. It is not a regional or local problem. And until, like you said, until we go to the UN for what it's worth, or some of those different bodies that are global in nature to start addressing it and creating some sort of internet bill of rights where even if you want to attack a country, don't go after its hospitals. I mean, in today's world, a normal thing to do when you attack a country is not bomb a hospital. So in cyberspace, we should probably have that norm kind of be a one from a nation state standpoint as unacceptable.
Yes.
But also from a criminal standpoint, something that should be extraditable, or at least if I know and I can, trace an attack back to a specific country, that I can at least prosecute the people who are responsible for it, at least in their home country. And that way at least create more of a fear within attackers. It won't eliminate attacks, it'll definitely reduce it. Um,
Mm.
but if there's greater global accountability for attack on healthcare facilities, we might be able to reduce the risk significantly. I'm not saying eliminate, but at least reduce it significantly. Deterrence is always a good place between, attack and defense.
Definitely. Look, James, it's been great to be on the show. I think this has been a great conversation. I think healthcare, life sciences, didn't even get to that yet. I think it's a really exciting space, and I think I hope your listeners enjoyed it.
Awesome. Dr. Saif Abed, thank you so much. You guys can obviously interact with Dr. Saif through Twitter and LinkedIn. We'll have his information on the bottom of your screen as we speak right now. You'll see his Twitter handle and his LinkedIn, so you can connect with Dr. Saif. You can follow me on Twitter, James_Azar1. And you are listening to the CyberHub Engage podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for watching, listening. Make sure you're subscribing on YouTube if you're watching us on YouTube. And thank you so much, Dr. Saif. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We are signing off right now.